Welcome to the Brigham Young University Family History Library webinar series. My name is Braden Knudsen and I'll be your host for this webinar today. We'd like to thank everybody for joining us. As we get started here, we'd like to ask you to participate in some of the polls that we have down at the bottom of the screen as we go through some of our announcements. So our next webinar will be on Thursday, November 9th at 5:30 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. And that webinar is titled Stand and Deliver, What If Your Ancestor Was a Criminal? And then on Friday, we have Back Up Your Data Now or Cry by James Tanner also. And that will be on Friday, November 10th at 4:30 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. And we encourage you to come to both of those. They'll be great webinars and very informative, and encourage you to invite your friends and family to participate as well. So today we'll be pleased to hear from James Tanner, who will be giving a presentation titled Researching Your Enslaved Ancestors. James Tanner has a bachelor's degree in Spanish and a master's degree in linguistics from the University of Utah. He received a Juris Doctor degree in law from Arizona State University. He worked for 39 years as an Arizona trial attorney. He previously owned a retail computer business and an Apple Macintosh software company. James has over 35 years of experience in genealogical research and is a blogger for Genealogy Star and the blog Rejoice and Be Exceeding Glad. He served for 10 years as a missionary at the Mesa, Arizona Family Search Library and is currently serving at the BYU Family History Library. He is a co-author or author of over 25 books on genealogical research and has presented at expos and conferences around the U.S. and Canada. James has 7 children and 33 grandchildren. As we turn this over to James, just like to remind everybody that we have a comments box and a questions box on the right-hand side of the screen. Any questions we'll make sure are answered by the end of the presentation, and we will turn the time over to James now.
Howdy, this is James Tanner. We're here for another webinar from the BYU Family History Library on the campus of Brigham Young University, Provo, Utah. We'd like to remind everyone that these webinars are recorded and uploaded to our BYU Family History Library YouTube channel and encourage you to subscribe to the channel. Subscribing not only helps you get a little notification of the new videos as they're uploaded, but it also helps us have a little bit, tiny bit of visibility on YouTube, which has millions and millions and millions of videos. Okay, so we're going to talk today about researching your enslaved ancestors. And to get into that topic, we need to have some history about what happened in the world. The important thing about understanding the history of any of the subjects, no matter where you're doing research for your ancestors, where that might take you, understanding the history helps to help you to understand where to find the records. Everything that happened to your ancestors historically, whether they were from Europe or from Africa, from New York, from any part of the world, knowing the history gives you an insight into the type of records that may have been kept, and also helps you to understand some of the things that may have happened to your ancestors that otherwise seem inexplicable. So it's very important to understand not only the time, the history, but the places, the history, and the people in your ancestry. Every one of those factors is very, very important. Now, the beginnings of slavery in America are fairly well documented. And so the whole concept here is to go back into the very beginning of it. We have a tendency to focus on the slave issue as an 19th century issue during the 1800s when it became a national political issue in the United States. But it actually dates back, the whole idea and the concepts and the practices date back into antiquity. But where they begin here in the Americas, among the European settlers of America, was in 1501, when Spanish settlers brought slaves from Africa to Santo Domingo, and that's presently the Dominican Republic. What happened subsequently is, as the slave trade began in the Caribbean, in the Caribbean islands, that was where a lot of the a measurable number of people ended up coming across into America itself, under the continental American continent. So the next and earliest time, it was 1619. They had 20 African slaves were brought to Jamestown, and those were the first people imported, enslaved people imported into the Britain's North American colonies. So this is a situation which has been around for many, many, many years, and subsequently there are a fairly large percentage of the population of the United States that are descendants of these people who came from Africa. The next milestone that we need to look at here is that the Dutch West Indies Company imported 11 black male slaves into New Netherlands, and this is understand that these are northern colonies, not the southern colonies. I think we have a tendency at this time period to identify slavery with the South, whereas the origins of slavery in America were definitely in the North. And in 1636, the first American slave ship, called the Desire, was launched in Massachusetts, and this began the colonial North America's slave trade. So this is the date of the 1636 is the date of the origin of the slave trade. 1640, John Punch was a runaway black servant, and he was the first documented slave for life. Now, the implication of this is interesting, because the idea of slavery in say the most common concept of the process was that it was always a lifetime. You were a slave, you were always a slave, et cetera, et cetera. No. And before the mid 1600s, slaves and what we would call indentured servants and or transported people were often treated exactly the same way. One of the things that is interesting about American history is that we have a tendency to write out of history those parts of the history that we don't particularly find acceptable under whatever change in political climate that occurs as time passes. The contrast, for example, on this issue is the problem of transported people from Europe. Now, transported person is that's another euphemism that we use, because what's happened is that a person in Europe, for whatever crime, could be arrested. Primarily, we find this among our English ancestors, but that occurred with all of the colonial people. And if they were arrested, then one of the sentences, because they simply had filled all their jails and didn't have any incentive to build any more jails, they just put them on boats and shipped them to America or to Australia, or whichever destination seemed most politically advantageous at the time. And some of the early historians of American colonies calculate that as many as 40% of all of the colonists, all the people who came to America, were either indentured servants or transported or slaves. So they were all in the same essential category when they reached America. There was no particular difference based on the way that they were treated, what their advantages were, and how they lived. The difference between an indentured servant and a slave is basically the term. It's like having a rental property as opposed to having an absolute ownership property. An indentured servant was usually for a term of years, and the most common term was 7 years, but that was very, very variable depending on the circumstances. So when a person became an indentured servant, they were essentially a slave for a term of years. They had no particular rights to ownership or to leave or to do anything that would, you know, make a person what we would think to be the indications of freedom. But that does not minimize the how the terrible nature of slavery. It simply indicates that this particular the particular category of slavery became a tremendously important political issue as time passed. We don't find campaigns to end indentured servants. That was an economic condition that basically became less and less viable as we proceeded into the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s. So in 1641, Massachusetts was the first colony to legalize slavery. So if I were to ask you which colony and which part of America was the first part of America to legalize slavery, you would probably not have suggested that it was Massachusetts. So this is kind of, you have to kind of get this process in your mind that when you're doing genealogical research and you're looking back from your ancestors, you should not be surprised to find out that your Massachusetts ancestors were slaves or enslaved people. Now, slavery began to be legalized as a practice in subsequent to the 1641 in Massachusetts, following in 1650 by Connecticut, 1663 by Maryland, in 1664 New York, New Jersey legalized slavery, Maryland and Carolinas and Virginia imposed lifelong servitude, and 1700 Pennsylvania legalized slavery, and so forth. And if you look at this carefully, you'll understand that slavery as an institution in America before the formation of our country as the United States did not begin in the South. It became an issue in the South, but it did not become it did not originate in the South. Now, think about this: if you're doing research on your ancestors, and there are some question about the status of the people that you're researching, there's not a tendency to have in your mind that these people could have been enslaved if they lived in the North, and that's just something that we need to kind of readjust as we go back and do the history of our families. Now we talk about the other part of this, and that is abolition. And the abolition movements began in the 1700s, shortly after the United States declared independence from Britain. In 1777, Vermont was the first of the 13 colonies to abolish slavery and enfranchise all adults. Now, this is kind of an interesting situation because the history says, oh, they enfranchised all the adults, and the answer to that is they enfranchised adult males who own property. They didn't enfranchise everyone. This was not, the idea that people could vote was something that took a pretty long time to develop in the United States. Native Americans, for example, were not given the right to vote until 1920s. And of course, we know about the struggle. If we have any knowledge at all of history in the United States, then we learn, some of us lived through what we call the Civil Rights Movement, where there were large parts of our population which had been denied the right to vote. And it was a long series of laws and legislative actions and actual battles in the streets that created that overcame that disability. In 1780, Pennsylvania began gradual emancipation. So in most of these colonies, slavery had existed for over 100 years before there were any efforts to begin the process of abolishing legalized slavery. In 1784, there were 700,000 enslaved people in the United States. And so what we were looking at was a fairly substantial population of people who would be considered enslaved. In 1857, which is the big kind of milestone in the whole process of overcoming this institution, was the Dred Scott decision. And the essence of that boiled down to what the Supreme Court had to say on the matter, was that blacks could never be citizens and that the federal government cannot outlaw slavery. So it's kind of set the stage for a confrontation between individuals who had very strong feelings that were anti-slavery and those who wanted to protect their economic interests in enslaving other people. And of course, we need to remember the 1863 Emancipation Proclamation, which freed all the slaves in the rebel territory. The category or the legal basis of these people who had been freed from enslavement was not clarified by the Emancipation Proclamation, and that took up until the 1960s and into the 1970s before all of that could be clarified. So almost 100 years more of uncertain and unequal treatment of people under the law in the United States. And in 1865, slavery was abolished by law, but only by law and not by cultural and civil and personal actions that were taken by individuals and by institutions. Okay, so that's kind of our short history of people who were enslaved in America. Now we're going to focus on the genealogical research and how that history affects our ability to find and discover the records of our ancestors. So first of all, we start with what we know, and this is just a basic thing about genealogy, is going from the known to the unknown. It's really the basis of all research. We start with what we know, we move into acquiring information about what we don't know, and then we develop our theories or our conclusions from from the information that we obtain. So the reality of this is that there's the time period here is a date 1870. So if we go from the present day back in time to the 1870s, is we have a situation where we have things like the U.S. federal census records, and we have vital records, we have land and property records, we have church records, and we have, in short, records that we normally use for genealogical research can be used to find those who are the descendants of our enslaved ancestors. So once the process was begun, the availability of records and the availability of having the people recorded as in the records changed from being recorded as property to being recorded as people. And that wasn't an instantaneous change, but the time period here is around the 1870s. So a person with a predominance of black ancestry or African American ancestry going back in time will have about the same level of difficulty finding their ancestors as anyone else in the country, in the United States, based on the existence of records back to the early 1900s and then into the late 1800s. Now, there's a tendency to kind of characterize research into formerly enslaved families, uh, into their ancestral lines, as being very, very difficult. Well, it is difficult because genealogy is difficult, not difficult per se uh, into the 1900s as such. Um, the interests there, in a lot of cases, are confused with the fact that anyone who was extremely poor in the South, white or black, anyone who lacked property or who had very little economic impact they're all difficult to find. It's not restricted to simply to those who were formerly enslaved. So, but we have some very specific records now that are being made generally available in a number of different areas. And the first of these is a post-Civil War set of records called collectively the Freedmen's Bureau. And the Freedmen's Bureau was a establishment to help the transition from slavery to citizenship, and it providing food, housing, education, and medical care. Now, depending on your attitude, it's very, very difficult in this such kind of a discussion to avoid politicizing or becoming adopting one or another polemic on the subject of slavery or the plight of the former slaves or any of the other issues that may have existed historically in the United States. But to the extent that there are records, there are now becoming more available, quite a large body of records of the people who were formerly enslaved in the country. And this one is that emancipation freed at the time, about 4 million slaves. So there's once again, recognizing that there's a substantial number of people in the country today who are descendants of these people who were originally enslaved. And so by providing this information, the Bureau was essentially creating a set of records, which in a lot of cases originally was focused on the banking records, on financial records, but now are expanding into other records that were available and kept by the Freedmen's Bureau and other similar kinds of projects. So this is really the first time in the U.S. history when the names of those individuals were systematically recorded and preserved for future generations. To a large extent, going back beyond that barrier, the 1870 barrier, back to the 1860s and before, it just really becomes a steep a curve of learning and a steep level of doing research. So it's not like you're going to have an easy path in getting back to those ancestors once you hit that time period of the Civil War. So the Freedmen's Bureau is available, and these records are beginning to be made available from the Ancestry.com, which is one of the websites that has a lot of the Freedmen Bureau records. FamilySearch.org has those records, and the records that are on FamilySearch.org are free, as are the records from the Archives.gov, which is the National Archives of the United States. And these are the three main areas of people who are, organizations that are adopting and using and implementing searches into these records that are now becoming more and more available. Not only are they becoming available in the sense that you can search the records, but they're also becoming available in that they are being indexed, and so they can be searched electronically. There is also a website called the Freedmen's Bureau Project, and that is, I put the address of it, but if you just type in the a Google search, Freedmen's Bureau project, you'll be able to find this particular website. It's discoverfreedmen.org. And this is the kind of the main clearinghouse for this, one of the clearinghouses for this type of project. This isn't necessarily going to have all the records. It's more of an informational, historical, and look at it site. But they are starting to get some other websites besides the two big online genealogy programs that have records from this time period. Then there is also another website. This one does have records, and it is called the Freedmen's Bureau Online, and its URL is Freedmen's Bureau, spelled out, one word, .com. And this is another valuable website for discovering the records that were created post-Civil War. Now, the Freedmen's Bureau records themselves are also being put online and there are a number of places in addition to the large websites that I was mentioning and these other websites. This is the Smithsonian Institution, and they have begun putting records up in conjunction with the Smithsonian's website. I'm not sure that some of these records aren't duplicative, but I would encourage anyone who's doing research into this area to look at all of the websites available, and not just the ones that I'm going to mention here, but to do extensive searches on these original records and see what's happening, because there are a number of projects and out there and individual societies that are involved in the idea of promoting the indexing and making these records more available. This one has too much of a difficult. I'm not going to read you the URL for the Smithsonian. You're just going to have to put in Smithsonian and Freedmen's records and do a search, because you can come. Another thing you can do in these videos, of course, if you're watching this online in a recording, is to stop the recording and then make a note of the information that appears. Now, if for whatever purpose you may find that the Freedmen records are helpful, valuable, and move you back maybe one, or if possible, 2 generations, and in some cases even 1 or 2 more. But at the end of this, you're going to have to start digging deeper to find records that are helpful to doing this subject. So first of all, you're going to get into the same records that you would get into if you were doing research in the South. And you're going to need to know as much information as possible about your ancestors. And the key here is going to be locating your ancestors physically. In other words, where did they actually live? Where were they? And if you do understand that, and you're able to identify a specific location or town or area where they resided post-Civil War, then you can begin your research in that area to get into Southern plantation records and property records of all kinds that exist, and then probate records and deeds and other local records. In what I've been doing research, by the way, recently in Rhode Island, and you would hardly think Rhode Island would be classified as a southern state, but my research, as I go back into the Rhode Island records, I am finding in reading the town records that it is very frequent that black servants and enslaved people and others are mentioned, and even information about them is explained in the town records. So it's basically what happens here is that you have to begin to evolve from a reliance on what I call the big 3 or 4 main records, census, and um, vital records, and birth and death records, those vital records, and then also cemeteries and things like that. All of those records become less and less important the more detailed and more um, information that you try to obtain going back in time. So you're going to have to dig into these various categories of records. And there's no simple way to say, okay, well, you go here to look for Southern plantation records, or you go here to look for Southern property records. What you'll run into in a lot of cases is they'll say, oh, those records were destroyed. You know, Sherman's march to the sea, so they lost all the records. Well, that's there's always a situation going back in time where there's excuse me, a danger that the records have been lost. But that didn't necessarily erase anything, you know, the world from existing at that time. And there were many records that survived. And it begins to be a task to actually get into the archives and um, make them available. And one thing I have to observe is that many of the southern states have uh, the lowest numbers of digitized records and online records of any of the states in the United States, uh, perhaps as a reflection of their economic difficulties, but in many cases the records have not been made as available as they could be. Uh, very simply for the reason that there is this degree of unwillingness to face up to to the to the past and the history that we do have in the United States. So there's my editorial comment for the day on the record. But we, as genealogists, we've seen some pretty interesting situations that have developed in some of the southern states with regards to their records and their availability of those records. So it takes some digging to get into the records if that's the part of the country where your ancestors came from. I would also kind of as kind of a side note on that that issue to mention that as I've been trying to illustrate as we go into this, that many of the enslaved people were part of the northern states, and even very heavily into New England, and so there's no question that you need to be careful and not try to overly categorize your ancestors simply uh, by the fact that they may have lived as enslaved people, so that they well, obviously, if they were enslaved, they lived in the South. Well, the answer is that's not true. They may have lived in the North and not in the South. Also, runaway slaves from newspapers or other documents. They were, you know, there. If that happened, then there were often advertisements out looking for people to run them down. In a sense, you know, we have the terminology in the American West of bounty hunters. Well, you had bounty slave hunters also. The basic here, I think that's helpful in getting past the kind of the first stage of genealogical research into African American ancestry would be to take a DNA test. And I would suggest that you may want to take a number of DNA tests, at least the major DNA company suppliers that have family trees and have information to help you contact and interact with other people. Uh, One of the greatest difficulties, of course, of the slave trade was that the families were separated and that people uh, were not allowed to create families. And so the whole concept here of doing DNA testing helps to reconstruct relationships back a number of generations. And the larger the company and the larger the database of people in their family trees and that can be matched and who have taken the test, the more advantage there is to to getting involved. And the biggest companies today are Ancestry, of course, who's promoting it rather heavily. 23andMe, which is also uh, becoming a big promoter of DNA testing, and MyHeritage, who has lately gotten into the uh, area of DNA in a big way, and is developing some very complex and very interesting uh, abilities to trace DNA. Now, when we're talking about DNA on this level, we're not talking about DNA tests that tell you that you do or don't have African ancestry. Um, Obviously, that may be a question, and to some, it may be a surprising issue to find out that they do have ancestry in Africa, and to others, it would only confirm what they already knew. But the issue here is that you take a DNA test, the companies then match you up with potential relatives. And that is where the power of these tests come from, because the larger the number of people that are in these family trees, the more likely it's going to be that you're going to find people who are related to you. And you can begin to create a family tree from the relationships and the combined information from a number of people as you find people that you're actually, that they say you are related to. So this is one way to go about building a family tree, and especially it relies heavily, of course, on cooperation among those people who have taken their DNA tests. So this is, but this is a basic way to get started. And the website that I would recommend to get started with is ISOG. Go back there. I didn't bring up a URL. It's just isog.org, ISOGG. It's the International Society of Genetic Genealogy, and this website has a wiki that's attached to it. And here's where you can get detailed comparisons, side-by-side comparisons of all of the major genealogy testing companies that are involved in genealogical DNA testing. And they go into details about the costs involved and the advantage and disadvantages of all the different kinds of tests. And it's really one of the more basic references online for understanding how DNA testing might help you break some barriers back in your family history. The other one is the Family History Guide. It's the fhguide.com. And it has a section on getting started with African American research, and it's step-by-step instructions on the places and the references out to the resources that are available to do African American research. So here's here's another resource that you can go to get started in learning about the African American research. Now, the FH Guide is not limited to this. It's also has step-by-step instructions for getting into websites, all four of the large websites: Family Search, Ancestry, MyHeritage, and Find My Past. So going to the fhguide.com gives you an instructional step-by-step, very, very much organized way of approaching understanding how to do genealogical research, as well as use those big four websites. In this particular area, as important as it is in all genealogical research, it's even more important to do careful, documented, and well-evaluated research. You really need to be step by step going back, documenting and making sure that you understand each step and each connection in the records that you do find. The importance of doing this is that, as I mentioned earlier, just a second ago, about the focusing on the kind of what I call the big four records, is the records of censuses run out. The earliest census that's really valuable to us without having other records and collaboration from those records is the 1850 census. Vital records in the United States only go back into, with any consistency in any of the states, back into the late 1800s, if that, or the early 1900s. Uh, Cemetery records always go back into antiquity, but they're not as reliable as they could be, especially for people who were enslaved or suffered extreme poverty. And then the last of those records are the ones that are most commonly looked at are the records of the people that we call the vital records, birth, death records like that. And the oldest of those are the marriage records that go back uh, probably as far as any of the records do. Now, if you think about this culture and the society that created this enslavement, you realize that very few of these records are going to be as useful as other records. And so one of the challenges of doing genealogical research back with either people who were enslaved or very poor is to use alternative records that primarily property records and land and property records and church records and other methods of trying to trace people that otherwise would not have been documented. Uh, One of the other things that I think is extremely important in doing research in ancestors, particularly in the South, and this is what we've learned by, I personally don't have any ancestors who came from the South. So this is not something that I've done myself personally, but I've had very close friends and associates for many, many years whose families came entirely from the South. And we have kind of working together on doing research, and that doesn't mean I haven't done an extensive amount of research in the South. It's just that I don't have any personal interest in it. But important there is to visit the places and talk to the people and ask the questions, because this is also important any place else, but it's even more important when you get into places where the people were living in extreme poverty. You really need to go there. You need to go to the local libraries and the local archives. You need to talk to the people. They may not be anxious to talk to you, but you can generally find people who will be. And if you're persistent in going in and looking for records and looking for the information, it's very possible that you may find that information. I also encourage people to look for local and state historical societies, organizations of people who follow ethnic or national or racial lines, all sorts of organizations out there. What's come up, by the way, as being a major genealogical tool in the last short period of time, meaning the last few years as opposed to something that we would have used many years ago, is a website called Facebook. We think of Facebook as social networking. Well, perhaps as genealogists, we should begin to realize that social is what we're looking for. And so getting onto Facebook, we've had some experiences lately. I've done some blog posts about individuals who have made lists of thousands and thousands of Facebook pages that are dedicated to organizations that are either directly involved in genealogy or contain information like museums or archives and things like that, where there's other contact information. So I'd encourage getting in and looking around on Facebook for people who may live in the area where your ancestors lived. And that's another kind of resource that we have. Okay, well, that kind of sums it up. It is not, there's no instant solution to the problem of doing genealogical research. It really takes a concerted effort on the part of the individual who's doing the research to take the time to study and learn and come to understanding of the various records which can be and are available. And there are some, as I've indicated already, there's some helps in learning about that. There are, by the way, which I did not mention in detail, but there are dozens and dozens of books, hundreds probably, of books out there written on doing African American ancestral research. And it would probably be a good idea to go to libraries and see if they have any of those books. If not, they're available online uh, for purchase. You can also find them in online libraries on occasion. So thanks for watching. This has been another of the BYU Family History Library webinar series. And remember that these webinars are uploaded to our YouTube channel at sonyoutube.com, and look for BYU Family History Library. We now have over 340 videos as of this particular one. So we are still moving along. Thanks again.
All right, thank you very much, James, for the wonderful webinar and all the hard work that you do to put into these presentations. We'd like to thank everybody for joining us today and ask if you have any feedback to please let us know. We have a little box down at the bottom of the screen where you can let us know what you think of our webinar program and what we can do to improve them. We would encourage you to follow us on our social media sites to get up-to-date information on what's going on here at the library, and we hope to see you again on Thursday. Have a great rest of your evening.